Hi, welcome. Welcome to the Eastside Freedom Library. Thank you for joining us today in person and online as well. My name is Sangmani Labut. I am the Executive Director of the Eastside Freedom Library here. If this is your first time here at the library, welcome. The Eastside Freedom Library is an independent nonprofit library. Our work is around the intersection of labor history, African American history, immigration history, and social movements. Our mission is to inspire solidarity, advocate for justice, and work towards equity for all. We do that through a number of ways. Tonight's event is one of the ways that we help fulfill our mission. And stories is a central theme to the work here at the Eastside Freedom Library, and the gathering of and telling of stories through public programming, performances, and exhibits are vehicles for us to achieve our mission. Before I kind of talk about tonight's event, we have several upcoming events that might be of interest to you. On Thursday, May 4th, is Mu Pin, a reading by the cast of the play, followed by a conversation with the playwright, Ikata Zar, and director of the play, Eliza Rashid. Mi Pin is the first ever theater production by a Karen artist in the state of Minnesota, and so please join us for that conversation. And we also have on May 23rd, our 7th annual Union Job and Resource Fair. There's information on our website as well. And lastly, next month, on June 13th, is a reading of the stories Whiteness Tells Itself by David Mura, followed by a conversation with David Mura and Shannon Gibney on June 13th. And so all of this program is really made possible by supporters. We know that creating lasting change requires help from our supporters, and your support through individual donation, time, and commitment to the Eastside Freedom Library as well. And so we know that not everyone can give, and so if you are able to, there's envelopes here for donation. Otherwise, for folks online, there's ways for you to donate online as well. If you're unable to donate, please tell your fellow organizers, union members, and tell them about us and our work. And share with them the role of the Eastside Freedom Library in labor movement and that the movement that we do all together. And so before we move on to our program, I would like to offer some technical instructions for folks who are joining us through the virtual space. If you have any questions for our speakers tonight, for folks on Zoom, please put your questions on the Zoom Q&A feature. If you are tuning in on Facebook Live, you can do your questions on the comment function with the letter Q in front of your questions, so our team know that there are questions and not comments. And so, again, thank you for joining us this evening to celebrate May Day, May 1st, with the Eastside Freedom Library with this panel discussion of workers who have organized in Minnesota's leading cultural institution. And so what better way to celebrate May Day than to hear from some of these workers about their reasons for organizing, their strategies for organizing, and their experiences together. And so now I'll pass it along to Jennings Mercantile. Jennings is a board member, a member of the board of directors for the Eastside Freedom Library, and will be the moderator for this evening discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sang. Hi, I'm Jennings. I use they, them pronouns. I am, like Sang said, on the board here, and I'm also a community engagement specialist at the Science Museum and was involved in that organizing effort. We're going to start with introductions of our panelists. Beginning on my left, we have Kyle Imdek, who has worked at several jobs at the Minnesota Historical Society. Sites in internship and contract jobs before joining the History Day team in 2019. In his current role, he guides St. Paul Public School students through history research and argumentation and coordinates the 2 annual History Day contests. He's been involved with the MNHS Workers Union since December of 2020 and serves as a chief steward, executive board member, and organizing committee chair. Kyle also serves on the editorial board of the Ramsey County History magazine and is the proud dad of 2 cats and a spirited 1-year-old Annabelle. Next, we have Gretchen Haupt, who has been a culture worker in many roles since 2004 and is currently a paid worker at the Science Museum of Minnesota in the Evaluation and Research Department alongside her unpaid care work of parenting and organizing. Prior to moving to St. Paul in 2012 to work at SMM, home was St. Louis, Missouri, where she studied anthropology and museology at the University of Missouri, worked at the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra box office, and cut her teeth in visitor studies at the St. Louis Science Center. Before officially relocating to Minnesota, Gretchen spent 3 summers as a National Park Service interpreter in Grand Portage, Minnesota. And Gretchen is, in her words, which she is now making me read, a mediocre seamstress. And her favorite condiment is horseradish, parentheses, the kind that makes you feel like you got punched in the face. Next, Maya LeClaire has worked in the Library and Archives Department at the Minnesota Historical Society since 2015. The daughter of an AFSCME member and a 2014 graduate of Augsburg University, Maya has always been passionate about labor issues and has been involved in organizing at MNHS since 2020. She currently serves in an interim member-at-large position on AFSCME Local 3173's executive board, as well as serving on several committees and coordinating the union's social media channels, which she does a very good job of, in my opinion. You should follow their social media. In her spare time, Maya likes to play Dungeons & Dragons, where she inevitably ends up trying to organize a union in a fantasy setting as well. Ella Campbellman worked in the Visitor Experience Department at the Walker Art Center and was part of the formation of the Walker Worker Union, which I had to practice several times beforehand. The Walker Worker Union in 2020. Following the successful union campaign at the Walker, she worked for AFSCME Council 31 in Chicago to help organize workers at the Art Institute of Chicago and the School of the Art Institute. She's currently working as a gardener. Amanda Wolfson has been a historic interpreter with the Minnesota Historical Society since 2012. She became involved in the organizing effort at MNHS in the spring of 2021 after being recalled from the pandemic furlough. She currently serves on her local's executive board as the secretary-treasurer and as a member of the organizing committee. In addition, Amanda teaches German at the college level and is a hobby blacksmith. And finally, Mahmoud Alamar is an instructor at the Science Museum of Minnesota and interim secretary for the Science Museum of Minnesota Workers Union. Prior to his current role, he was a 4th grade teacher and then an elementary school computer science curriculum specialist in the Chicago Public Schools. So, unions. What's the deal with them? More specifically, why did your 3 institutions, why did you and your fellow workers unionize? And what problems or desires motivated you? That sounds perfect.
So we started our campaign in 2019, so pre-pandemic, which I think we went public during the pandemic, and I think it sometimes looks like it was a response to the pandemic, but was happening before that. I think everyone on our campaign has like their own union reason for organizing, as is I'm sure true for all of you. For me, I think like one of the core things was that I saw a lot of problems that I felt like my coworkers had good ideas about how to address that weren't going anywhere. And I think like there was just this, I don't know, it just felt like the institution existed at like 2 levels of like worker and management in a way that was like not, well, it was just working down and not working up. And there were no, it was like very hard for ideas to move up the institution. And especially like if you were not in a prioritized department or a department that had a close relationship with leadership. But I often think about it as like the tangibles and the intangibles, that there's like pay and like health insurance and benefits and whatnot, but then there's also sort of like feeling invested in where you are and wanting to change things for yourself and for your coworkers.
Yeah, I can speak for the Historical Society. We are a very siloed organization, and we always have been. Pre-pandemic, that was a problem as well. We have 26 sites across the state of Minnesota, with our main hub kind of being in the Twin Cities, but we've got a lot of folks, you know, up in Grand Rapids or down in Preston. And so we really wanted to find a way to come together as what our management calls one MNHS, right? Which is one organization kind of united, but like actually do that and be able to work with each other to do the work of history and just kind of prioritize a lot of things. Like you said, the tangibles and the intangibles, Ella, the better pay, better benefits, but also just a sense of community and solidarity and feeling like we care so much about our work and wanting that to be reflected in kind of the policies that impact our daily lives. So.
So I wasn't part of the organizing campaign from the very, very beginning, but I can speak to some of the reasons that I got involved fairly early on. The Science Museum started not that long after we reopened after the pandemic shut everything down. So it was like February-ish of 2021, I believe. And what was really incited the first folks to kind of start talking about this was repeatedly being left out of decisions that impacted workers, from the decision to have a police presence in the lobby, to the decision to repeal masking, to the decision to drop vaccine mandates. And all of these choices were made without any of the impacted workers in the room, and leadership's decision to be reactive to pushback from that, which willing to hear concerns, but repeatedly making decisions and then being surprised when there was pushback. And so one of the, of course, pay equity and what is a big piece among a lot of people at the Science Museum, but I think what really was the initial driving force was that balance of power and having an ability to be part of those decisions that impact the way that the organization is able to deliver on its mission.
And it seemed like the various managements responded some ways in different ways and in some ways very, very similarly to each other. So what obstacles did the managements of everyone's respective institution sort of put in your way in this process? Why don't we go in reverse chronological order this time?
All right. First, it feels a little bit like stolen valor to say that I was part of organizing, because my personal timeline is that I started at the Science Museum, then about a week later I signed a card, and then about a week after that the organizing campaign went public, and it was like a whirlwind after that. But being at the Science Museum during the time that the organizing went public really, every organization is progressive until it's time to actually be progressive. So we got a lot of those emails saying, well, I support unions in my personal life, but I don't see the need for one here because we're not bad like they are at Amazon or at Starbucks. And then down the line to see Howard Schultz testifying in front of Congress and saying well, I don't think we need a union because we're not putting children in mines or anything like that. So there was a lot of that messaging that there's really no need for a union here. There was a lot of advantage on the side of management in having control of those all-staff emails and all of these different channels that they could communicate, having meetings that weren't very openly anti-union, but it's an open space for everybody to just question and learn a little bit more before you make your decisions. So it really was a lot in the way of communicating one specific message and not really having a way as an organizing committee to have that same kind of impact and rebuttal area. Am I missing anything, Gretchen? Because it was a whirlwind those couple of months.
And one tactic that was utilized a lot at the Science Museum was as I'd mentioned, there were a lot of decisions that were made without workers, and one of those was a fairly disastrous compensation analysis plan, which really had kind of fractured any goodwill that the majority of workers had for our senior leaders. And an approach that was taken was to utilize direct frontline managers who had much better relationships with their staff to deliver anti-union messaging. So rather than it coming from the president or vice presidents, it was your direct manager casually, or not so casually, explaining why the museum had an anti-union stance and should be primarily union-free. But you should do your own research and you should make your own decisions, and but which was not received very well by. It was fairly obvious to most people that that's what was going on, and did get mentioned quite a few times in open forums that was a poor choice.
Yeah, and we experienced a lot of similar things to what the Science Museum experienced at the Minnesota Historical Society. But some things that I would add to that we experienced a lot at MNHS was a lot of what we refer to as third partying, where in a lot of the messages that management would put out about the unionization campaign, they wouldn't refer to us as Minnesota Historical Society workers or people's colleagues. They would refer to us very vaguely and nebulously as the union, as some kind of outside group that was coming in to try to get in between the workers and management and just stir up trouble, rather than something that rose organically from Minnesota Historical Society workers ourselves. And in addition to that, I think a tactic that our management used quite a lot was a little bit of fear-mongering, a little bit of the idea of, they would say things at like, you know, even if you unionize, the union can't guarantee that your wages will go up. They might actually go down during negotiations, or you might lose some of your benefits as part of a union negotiated bargaining agreement, which why would we ever, as union bargainers, agree to lower our own wages or benefits? It's absurd. But that came out a lot, even in the fact that the Minnesota Historical Society workers are guaranteed health coverage through the state employee group insurance program through state law, but management would imply that, oh, you might lose your health benefits, even though they can't really do that. So we experienced a lot of that kind of thing.
Yeah, related to third partying, I was in a meeting once in which I think I was like asking about my schedule. It was something related to my work specifically. And whoever I was talking to was like, oh, well, we'll have to ask the union about that. And I was like, you're going to send an email to walkerworkerunion@gmail.com. I am going to receive it. And I am going to reply and be like, that's fine. Like, yeah, we had a lot of sort of similarly, or like blaming. We had some managers blamed the union for not being able to offer raises, which was absurd. They could have offered. I mean, I feel like also like the Walker really existed in a state of like, that's about to happen. So like, don't worry, things are about to change. And it was kind of like, we're about to give you a raise. And then they were like, oh, we've taken these away. But there's no reason to believe that they were going to happen in the first place. And also, other people did get raises. So that was their own discretion to give and take as they pleased.
Management set up this football, and you were just going to run and kick the football, but now we're not going to do it. And I think to your point, Mahmoud, it really speaks to how this is the classic anti-union playbook. This is how managements have always treated unions in this country, maybe with fewer death squads than historically have been used, but similar ideological approaches, even in these institutions that think of themselves as so progressive and on the forefront of doing this equity work and serving people, because they just don't think of themselves as exploitative in those same ways. So how did, on your various campaigns, how did you deal with the fear and the fear-mongering of management? Because I know that it gets grueling and intense.
I guess I can kick us off. So at MNHS, I think a combination of things for us as organizers, having sort of weekly meetings where we would talk these things out, talk each other down if someone was having a particularly like freak out moment or whatever. But in terms of wider union support within our organization, our members and such, I think frequent and regular communication was really the biggest key for us. We have a very robust member action team structure where our organizing committee has basically divvied up our organization into different little chunks with an individual organizer assigned to be the main point of contact for that group of members, so that every single week those members get an update on what's happening, and we talk them through a little bit of, hey, if we're asking to do some kind of an action, talk through, what do you think management's reaction might be? So that instead of that member, that supporter, stewing amongst themselves over, oh goodness, what might happen, they're there with an organizer who can talk with them about it and strategize on, okay, then how would we respond? How do you think we're gonna respond to this? How will we support each other? Because collectively, we all have each other's back in this, and I think it takes a lot of just reminding people that this is a collective action. You are not in this alone. Even if something does happen, there are dozens and dozens of workers who have your back in this.
Yeah, I think similarly, just like reminding people that they're not doing anything by themselves. I think it's hard for people who haven't worked in union jobs maybe to like understand the actual like security that comes from a union, and you have to sort of like remind people, like teach people that like you can't, once you have a union, you can't just get fired for no reason. And I think we're not used to actually like thinking about ourselves in that way unless you've had a union job and had those protections. But I think, yeah, we just talked a lot about like what it would feel like to do things by yourself versus like what it feels like to do them when there's like all of your coworkers behind you. And I feel like the phrasing was kind of like around like people wouldn't let, like we wouldn't let that happen to you, or like if this thing happened, like we would all, like you're not by yourself dealing with it in a room with your boss or HR. You have other people who you can talk to and like be supported by.
Yeah, to that point, actually, there was an attempt at unionization at the Minnesota Historical Society in the early 90s, I think. So this had been a long time coming for us. And just after a year of talking to people and just hearing the same story over and over again of, I had this issue, I took it to my boss, we took it to HR, nothing happened. And they're just saying, it's okay, this is the same thing happening over and over again, but now we're together. We can do this together. You don't have to just kind of scream into the void. We can maybe just scream into the void together, at the very least, if we can't do anything, but we can scream together, and it's about community and solidarity in that way, I think.
Going off of that as well, Maya mentioned before how we are a pretty divided site. We have 26 different sites, and I work at a metro area site, but not the hub. And in years past, when I first started, actually, I had coworkers there who were involved in the 90s in the organizing effort that failed and still had bitter feelings about that. And part of that was feeling unsupported by different parts of the organization. And the siloing is pretty intense, and it's something we're still working on. So I think people at my site, when we first went public, every union-eligible person at my site was a card signer. So we had a lot of support with each other, but I think a lot of people were still maybe a little less comfortable with support from the rest of the organization. So that's something we're still working on, and it's been helpful to have somebody be able to come to me as their contact and be able to get a response right away, or be able to organize a meeting with a committee that can help address different problems, or really see how this is not just among our individual site staff anymore. There are people who are willing to come to us and work with us and back us on, sometimes on problems that don't affect anybody else. So it really has been that community building effort that has kind of helped give people courage, I think.
This is still on. I think what was really one of the most effective things at the Science Museum was the one-to-one small group communication structures that we had in place, because it is messaging is so much more effective and relevant when it's coming from somebody who you you know personally and maybe even does the same sort of work that you were doing. And that was a two-way communication structure. So we were able to both push out information in advance to inoculate, like this is what is probably going to happen. But we were also receiving information at the same time, which allowed us to stay multiple steps ahead of where leadership may have been coming from to try and to seem unsettling. And it actually kind of turned around and made people feel like leadership was being condescending to them, as in, we are the source of information, we will keep you informed. But after they had already heard that 48 or 72 hours before from their colleagues. So all it did was further legitimize us as the experts in what was going on. And I really feel like by the time we had gone public, we had spoken to a whole lot, like a very large proportion of the organization, and there was really not a whole lot of people who were on the fence. They were either not on board or they were on board, and there really wasn't a whole lot that leadership was able to do to discourage that many people who had already made up their minds. And it was really just a matter of continuing those relationships. And we're not that far out from our certification in late January, but we still have to continue to build those relationships and anticipate what communications are going to come from our management around what issues and in ways that we can get in front of and continue to inoculate through this negotiation process so that our members know what to expect and what's going to happen next.
And then if I could jump in as well, one, we had like two wonderful organizers who would use all these sports metaphors in the Zoom calls and calm down the organizing committee before we could take everything like to a broader level. But part of it really came down to learning why people like were fearful in the first. Like there were some people, they don't want to put their name onto anything, and that's fine. And you have to meet them where they are, and you work with them on that point. There are some people who like will sign but won't take a public action, and that's fine. You meet them where they are. And build that level of solidarity. But another thing that I think helped mitigate the fear that people were feeling is that there were people who were afraid that if there was a union that their health insurance would go up. And health insurance went up in October and there wasn't a union. And there were people who were afraid that there would be layoffs if there was a union. And people started thinking about layoffs in November and there wasn't a union. And there were people who were worried that if there's a union that you can't change your schedule, you won't be able to get raises, and people weren't changing their schedules, and people weren't getting their raises, and there wasn't a union in place. So a lot of these doomsday worst-case scenarios of what would happen if there was a union in place were kind of already happening, and that mitigated, I think, some of the fear that people were feeling. Then the rest came out to organizing.
Yeah, when management says that the union will make the sky fall every day for 4 months, it loses its power after a while. And I think one of the points that a lot of people have brought up is the management talking point of, well, even if you do get this, even if you do win, nothing will fundamentally change. But I think one of the things that people have touched on is that going through this process and being organized fundamentally changes relationships. So how has the process of organizing impacted relationship with your other coworkers, breaking down silos, and how has it changed the relationship with management that you all have?
Thank you. The Walker has offices all over the building that are separate from each other, and it's easy to like not know anyone in one corner. And once we started organizing, and you sort of like had context for these people outside of being in a meeting and like maybe being annoyed or someone not responding to you or something like that. And I think we were all, like socially, it was a lot more fun. And also as like workers, it was a lot easier to work with people when you liked them and were invested in them. And we're kind of like, oh no, I know that this person's like having a hard week, so like they haven't gotten back to me. And I know, you had a little bit more, I feel like it makes you have an understanding of people as human outside of their like little robot worker mode. And then, yeah, I think that like just knowing people's backgrounds and stories and experiences at work and outside of work makes you care about them and feel invested and want to fight for them and want to stay. Like, it was a lot harder to leave the Walker than I would have expected because, like, I had a coworker who left and who was like, who would have known that trying to, what was it? She said something like, who would have known that trying to be more invested in my workplace would make it harder to actually now leave because I'm invested in all of you. But yeah, it was, I mean, there were people who, like, their anti-union responses really changed how I thought about them also, which was hard to reckon with for some people, like for my relationships with some people, but also seeing how they responded to us made me be like, well, this is revealing something in you that I like didn't see before and didn't know. Someone else should go. I've been talking for a while.
This is a little bit of a repeat of something I've already said, but I think, you know, when I was first brought into the organizing effort, we weren't public, so it was brought to me as, oh, we're working on a community building activity. And I had been furloughed and then laid off, and most of my coworkers from the before times didn't return. So I did feel really disconnected and really disappointed with how that process all went. So one benefit is because I've always been close with the staff who works at my site, but I have never before this been close to anybody who doesn't work at my site. So there's, I think, 6 people in this room right now who I did not know before the organizing effort, and now I consider them friends. And it's been interesting because it also makes me feel closer to the organization as a whole, because I became close to people who work at what we used to call downtown at my site. We were told not to do that, but it felt right. So it also has made me more engaged in my workplace and in my coworkers, because it's something where I feel like it's not just other people caring about our site, but our site caring about the rest of the network as well.
And I guess between like just colleagues, I would echo what Amanda said for Minnesota Historical Society. Before unionization, I knew maybe people at 3 sites, maybe. Now I know people by name at every single Minnesota Historical Society site, and I can barely walk to the bathroom at the History Center without running into somebody and being like, oh, hey, yeah, I know you from such and such. So it really changes the dynamics of being able to know each other and support each other across a large institution. But Jennings, to the other half of your question of how it impacts relationships between workers and managers, in my opinion, I think it brought out what those relationships already were. That managers who were already very supportive of the employees under them, who had their backs regularly, who would go to bat for them if there was a problem, they still do that now that we're unionized. And they're doing their best to make sure that they're abiding by our contract, which is implemented today, while still, thanks, while still maintaining the same kind of positive relationships that they've already had. Whereas managers who did not have that kind of a dynamic with their employees, who had a reputation for being retaliatory when an employee would speak up or things like that, they may still try to do those sorts of things every now and again, but they're less likely to get away with it. So I think it's brought the relationships out that were already there, but with that added layer of protection that makes them hopefully think twice if they're the negative type of a manager.
The role that I have at the Science Museum in visitor studies is really to elevate the voices of our audience and our visitors and constituents to look for patterns and communicate that information to help make decisions. And that's one of in organizing, having the opportunity to talk to so many of my colleagues and to really kind of push forward those concerns and elevate those voices. But personally, it was really affirming and, it was amazing to not feel like I was the only person, that it was a me problem that I was experiencing, that this was a structural problem. And the messaging that very frequently is delivered is that this is a problem for you and your manager to work out. And this is, the people who are in leadership positions are there because they are smart, and you should trust the decisions that they have made. And when you are in an isolated bubble, your inclination, the way that you are conditioned, is to believe that the people who are in charge are there for a reason. But when you start talking to other people in other departments and who've been there for 30 years and who've been there for 12 months, and you hear the same problems and see the same things being unresolved, you start to develop a healthy skepticism for the power structures that are in your organization. And you feel entitled to push back on them, not that you are being ungrateful. And I think so that is one of the bigger ways that my relationships with my colleagues have changed. And in some ways that has filtered up towards the way that relationships with management is, it has become a little more tense, because I don't just accept what is told to me without getting corroboration and triangulation from other sources now.
And if I could add just like one last thing to what you were saying about the relationship with management, is that I think during the process of building up toward the election and doing the organizing that was beforehand, it was like, well, there's a lot of us who are in support of the union, and this is how we're making our voice heard. But once the election happened and we were certified and we became a union, I think, at least for me, and I can't speak for anybody else, is the relationship is a lot more like, well, whether you were like silently supportive of a union or you were very vocally against a union, there's a union now. So like the circumstances have changed, and we need to like work together and make things happen, and bargain over things and actually come to conclusions. And I think the other side of that is we as workers, and then management as management, both have an understanding that there needs to be some kind of reparative work for the relationships that were damaged over the course of that. I think there's still no full understanding of what that looks like, and I think that that's something that, you know what, maybe we'll put it in a contract. But I think those are two things specifically about the relationship with management that have kind of shifted over time.
And Maya, to something that you said about the previous organizing efforts, this is a long time coming. I think one of the things about the past couple of years and about this panel specifically is the way that once one domino falls, once one workplace museum is organized, it's easier for the rest of them to be. I would love it if, again, in reverse chronological order, we could talk a little bit about how other campaigns and other contracts served as models for what happened, and then when it gets to you, Ella, where you had to look because there wasn't a comparable 6 months ago somewhere else unionized.
Well, definitely as we were strategizing and thinking about how to run our campaign, and I remember very, very early on when I joined, knowing that the MNHS wasn't public yet, but hearing that, like, oh, there's another cultural organization that is working on their campaign, and something that somebody dropped about, oh, and they were some oral history. I'm like, it's the History Center, isn't it? But having that as because I think that in the museum field and in culture workers, there is this, when you're a mission-driven employee, when you're a passion-driven employee, it is so easy to accept the narrative that you are lucky to get any money to do this. And being understaffed and being underpaid is just part of this, of being, is the nonprofit discount. You are lucky, and this is just the way that it is. And I think that's a huge mindset shift that's really difficult to overcome, even in the sense of, is it, some of the questions that I would answer on when I was having these organizing conversations is that, yes, everybody needs a union. Nonprofits aren't exempt, and in fact, there's just as much of a reason to organize when you're in a nonprofit situation, because the resources are so scarce, and it is so easy to fall into that mindset of scarcity. And so seeing that this had been successful at the Walker, and knowing that this was such a strong campaign, and even as the Science Museum went into layoffs with the rationales that were being given around, this is just the way the museum field is. All museums are struggling with their attendance. All museums took a huge hit during the pandemic, but we exist in a cultural ecosystem where the Minnesota Historical Society just negotiated an amazing contract in the same environment, and they're not laying people off. And I know MIA isn't part of AFSCME, but they've been organized for a long time. They have free admission, and I haven't heard about any talks of layoffs at the Walker. Like, what is going on here? So again, it was just sort of, it's context to know that not only is it possible, but organizations can be successful in this. And I don't know if you want to add anything more, Mahmood, before we pass it off.
Yeah, one thing that was also very helpful is that there's not just cultural institutions unionizing within Minnesota or the Twin Cities or anything, but there were times that at least I would get a question that said, well, what do you expect, the museum to just voluntarily recognize a union? It's like, well, that's what they did in LA. So having that example that you could point to, or when we would get all staff messages of like, well, if there is a union, then layoffs might have to happen in seniority order. Here's a part of the contract from this institution. Like, but they do have a process. And right now, all we have is that like you can be laid off at any time for any reason or for no reason. So having some of those wins and some of those documents that are already created and be able to point to those and like, no, it is possible, was extremely helpful and honestly like uplifting at times when you needed to be lifted. So that's all I have to add, I think.
We on? Cool. For us, the other thing with the Minnesota Historical Society is that we are affiliated with the state of Minnesota, but we are not state employees. We get state health insurance that is collectively bargained, but we were never able to collectively bargain that ourselves. So we had right away from the beginning of all these, just knowing what the state employees made, there was actually a department within the MNHS that the State Office of Historic Preservation that moved from the MNHS to the state and immediately got so many more benefits. They got paid parental leave. It was pretty stark. So we had that coming in. Remind me when the Walker went public.
September 2020.
September 2020. Okay, so that would have been right around the time that we started having conversations with AFSCME. I just remember, I don't know which came first, chicken or the egg, but I just remember seeing someone post in an MNHS Facebook group, oh wow, look, the Walker has a union. And I was involved in organizing at the time, and I was like, oh yeah, look at that. That's wild. So just seeing the Walker go public absolutely spurned me on. The fact that it was the same team at AFSCME who did it made us maybe even more confident in what we had chosen the right union for us. But it really just kind of, getting out of that silo was the first thing. We had everything there. We had the previous attempts. We had this, the state workers looming above us with all of their amazing benefits. To me, it really was just kind of the push of the pandemic, being furloughed, the kind of issues surrounding that, and then, oh, the Walker's doing it? Yeah, let's do it. We're done. This is going to be awesome. So.
Back on that just a little bit with the note that the social media of the Walker winning their union or going public helped us recruit to our organizing committee too. In fact, the way I wound up being an organizer was I liked that Facebook post, and then an organizing committee member reached out to me and was like, hey, I heard you like unions. So that was fantastic. And the other thing that I would add when we were speaking about the national context of our organizing campaigns, something that was really helpful, for me at least, was our parent union, AFSCME, has this subgroup called Cultural Workers United, where we were able to actually be in conversation with other organizers from across the country, which helped us to feel both like that we're not alone and that some people are facing even tougher campaigns than we faced, and they are pulling it off. Like the Daniel Boone Regional Library System in Missouri has become the first unionized library system in that state, and that is incredible. And if they can pull it off, we can pull it off.
This is very flattering to hear. For me personally, I think about like 2 years before we started organizing, I remember noticing some national campaigns in, I think it was like publishing and journalism, and that was actually like the first time that I understood that you could like create a union, that it wasn't something that just like already existed where you worked and you either had it or you didn't. And then for me personally, the biggest sort of like internal light bulb was the New Museum in New York, because they felt like the closest to the walker. Like I was kind of like, oh, if the people there are doing it, that actually feels like really kind of one-to-one to us. And then personally, the thing that I remember giving me a lot of like energy, I think this was before we had reached out to AFSCME, when a couple of coworkers and I had just been sort of talking about it a little bit, is I saw a friend who had seen a friend, sorry, that's a little confusing, but basically he had seen someone who worked at the New Museum in like 6 months apart. And the first time he was involved in union, he was asking her about it, and the first time he talked to her, she was kind of like, I don't know. I've heard a little bit about it, but it's not, I don't know if it's for me. And then he like saw her 6 months later, and she was just like, I'm all in, like, this is mine. Like, she was like really gung-ho and really active and enthusiastic. And I think like I was really I could see a lot of my coworkers be the type of people who, like you said, like progressive in theory until I'm asked to do something, essentially. And I think hearing that story of her shifting, like moving, and not just starting by being someone who's like, you asked me and of course I'm in, you know, like, but someone who can actually be pushed, was very inspiring. But yeah, then lots of campaigns out of LA, I think just like starting to see the movement build and seeing it in people, like in jobs that felt like they like closer to mine, which is not to say that I think it's like really easy to sort of separate ourselves as like cultural workers or office workers from traditional unionized fields. And I think like that was sort of the intro, like that's like where it started, where you're like, oh yeah, they're similar to me. And then a component of that is also like an awakening about yourself as a worker, and like sort of a realignment with like your like workers as opposed to with management. And yeah, that was.
Thank you. Sorry for going off script with that question. So, Kyle, to your point about the contract enactment, what are things that your union is seeking or plans to seek through the collective bargaining process? What are the things that, in spite of management's protestations that nothing will change, that you have now decided to implement formalized structures around?
Yes, I can start it off since I brought up our contract. But yeah, so I mean, there's a huge variety of things that you bargain for in collective bargaining, right? But for me to just run through a few highlights that I particularly think are important. Before we unionized, the lowest paid workers at Minnesota Historical Society were paid $14.01 per hour. Starting today, the floor is $18 an hour, over a 20% wage increase. That is huge. And for me, I think that's probably the thing I'm most proud of in our contract. But but also we have 6 weeks of paid parental leave in our contract, which is huge. We also, for the first time in the Minnesota Historical Society's history, have an actual structure by which people will get raises. Many of those of us who work at the Historical Society have never received an actual raise in our time there. And now we have clearly defined step increases where if you have been with the Historical Society for this amount of time, you get this amount of a wage increase, which is a huge change. And beyond just that, the fact that we have an actual official grievance procedure where if someone thinks that their rights have been violated by management in some way, there's a formal process set up to get that addressed.
Well, relatedly, we also got 6 weeks of paid parental leave in our contract, and I think something that really stood out to me in the negotiating for that is that the Walker, we asked for 12, but the Walker agreed to 6 like immediately and gave it actually to everyone at the institution, not just the people in the union. And they said when they agreed to this that they were already talking about it and planning on doing it. And I just think like there's like a way to hear that and be like, oh, that's nice that they were already talking about it. And I was like, okay, well, when? Like you were already talking about it for how long? For the last 2 years, like, or only since we organized? And I think that felt really, I don't know, it's obviously like a very great tangible win, but also just like to actually push them to do something for their employees that they were thinking about and would maybe happen. But the other thing that I was actually thinking about today before this that I had really forgotten about is that a component of our contract is a recall list if you get laid off and they rehire the job within a certain time period, because we had pandemic layoffs like many people did. And in my department included, and then they were hiring for that position again, and there were people who had already had the job who had to reapply, and there was like a question about whether or not some of them were going to get it. Like it was kind of like they were going to offer the job to other people, and the idea that you would not hire someone back who had already been doing the job, who already knew like how to navigate the building, which was very confusing, like that. And I think just putting a formal system back into place for that is like a good example of also something that I would have had no idea was even available to us, and is actually like pretty standard in many contracts.
So we hadn't really dug into our contract proposal process, but we did a surprise, I did the bargaining survey as a evaluator. When I look at the feedback that we get, of course, pay is a huge thing, and because it was anonymous, it's really hard to know, are the pay concerns from our staff who are not earning a living wage, or like many folks at the Historical Society, are they staff who have been in their roles for decades and haven't seen any appreciable, they don't have access to the full breadth of their pay bands. There's very few, there are some cases where I feel like there needs to be massive changes to the pay band, but I really do feel like most of the people at the Science Museum would be completely satisfied with their pay grades if they had access to the full range of their pay grades. So I am an 11-year veteran of the Science Museum, and I am still in the very bottom zone of my pay grade, narratively described as someone who has zero experience in the job that they're doing. So I know pay is a huge issue. Having a objective process for advocating for, with your manager and with leadership for adjusting your pay based on skills that you've acquired, based on skills that you bring into the role. But for me, like one of the most important things is just cause language. So our handbook is just brutal. And it's an entire full-page, single-space list of reasons that you can be dismissed from your job, including no reason. And I have seen multiple people just vanish. disappeared into the ether. I've had meetings scheduled with people, and then I go to that meeting and they're not there because they were dismissed. They're treated basically like they're felons escorted out of the building. So there's definite lack of humanity in the way some of those things are carried out. And grievance processes, having that articulated so it is no longer at the subjective whims of a manager who, in what is considered disciplinary and what is not. I know our paid time off and leave policies are fairly flexible, but yeah, in many ways it is some of those like non-economic things that recognize the humanity of your staff that I feel need to get codified.
Another off-script question. I think a lot of museums and cultural institutions rely on public goodwill that has been built. The Science Museum sort of cultivates a reputation as, people, you love the dinosaurs, you love the big purple van that comes to your schools. And I think this really, management's fixation on the public perception means that they are susceptible to the image of the institution and what the image of the institution is seen to be doing. Throughout your campaign or after organization, have you felt like there has been a role of things that public pressure have done, the public visibility have done, that wouldn't have happened without the institution's desire to keep their images as squeaky clean as possible?
For me, I think I mainly just found it very comforting to know that they cared about what people thought about them, or that they were vulnerable to that. We didn't do really any press or anything like that. Like, I think that there were a lot of ways in which we could have gone really hard, but we were trying to, not totally burn it down, sort of. And I think I really just personally took a lot of comfort from being like, okay, we're not in like a Jeff Bezos sort of like, they don't care what anyone thinks about them situation. And I actually think that was also really helpful in terms of like talking to coworkers, of being like, well, how would it look if this happened, and I think that the like power of organizing is more like from within and from your coworkers, and I think like it's just really helpful that cultural institutions hopefully care what people think about them. Not all of them do. There's like, you see examples nationally of places really seeming to not care. And I mean, also the public has a short memory, so I think it's kind of like a flash pan, like you have the opportunity for like a flash pan, sort of like people getting mad, but then that's kind of not what sustains you.
Yeah, we absolutely use our social media very strategically. We purposely really didn't start to get too intense on social media until we started economic bargaining in November of last year. Management just wasn't moving, so we held an informational picket outside of their annual meeting, because we found that management not only dislikes it when we post about them on social media, they really don't like it when we talk to donors either. And it was kind of a double whammy with that one. And then so we did that action, and then we saw management move. And that same thing happened over and over again of management's not moving, we're doing an action. And we can directly tie several really good things that we got in our contract to actions that we did. And that's really kind of been something that we're really trying to talk to our members about, of like, we did this. We did this, no third partying. It was all of us showing up, taking a selfie with a poster saying why you're union, coming to a rally, coming to an informational picket. All of these things make management nervous. And unfortunately, it's not because we're coming together. I think it's because we are kind of publicly saying, hey, this isn't okay. And that has really been used to our advantage, I think, in organizing.
Yeah, I think for me, part of what shone through in terms of public support is that all solidarity by its nature is intersectional, and that's in part because all like anti-solidarity is also intersectional. Like there's nobody who is very vocally against any form of unionization who's also like a huge feminist, right? So those are all tied together. And there were instances where we would receive an email from a member of the Science Museum, or there would be an email like, oh, thank you for your membership, and the response would be, oh, I love being a member, and I also support the workers' right to unionize. So it's people who kind of patronize and support the Science Museum also in large part supported the unionization effort, but then one additional thing in my role as an educator through the Science Museum is that I go to different schools, and I'm there for about a week. I'm working with teachers, I'm working with their students, and it's happened like more times than I'd anticipated that when I'm there, the union steward at the school, it's like, oh, we heard about this and we're really happy for you. Like, congratulations on joining the fight with us. So there's a strong solidarity among the unionized workers that I think is just going to keep the ball moving and make Minnesota the land of 10,000 labor unions.
No more one big union, only a number of little ones.
Also, a little bit related on that same vein, just as far as like how encouraged you feel, because I'm in a role that works directly with the public every day, and I also work at a site that people have a lot of feelings about, and not always positive, and people express those feelings not always in the most comfortable ways. But when we were wearing our union buttons, I don't think anybody ever reacted negatively to it. We got a lot of support, like individualized support from the public. And that was just really encouraging on a day when we don't always get that kind of reaction. So just in general, it did feel nice to feel supported by the community at a place where we don't always feel that way.
And one more question, sort of broadly moving forward. How do you think that unionization can impact how your institution defines its mission and makes decisions about how to pursue that mission? I know a lot of our institutions have statements about what they value, how they put equity forward, but aren't historically as happy with equity being put forward by things like the workers' right to organize.
I think on like the most basic level, if your staff feel like comfortable and well compensated and not overworked and protected, they're going to do a better job. But I also think that institutions, well, like cultural institutions can kind of have this idea of like they're serving the public, but their staff aren't those people too, or like kind of like we're trying to have like racially diverse visitors, but like if you support your staff, you should also be supporting like financial, I mean like good pay for your staff so that people with different financial backgrounds can work there, or like groups to like internal staff groups to help like staff of color feel comfortable at the institution. And I think that there's this split of like we're serving the public, we have all of these ideas, but that doesn't actually like apply to us and our like internal staff and system. And so I think it just kind of feels like a like walk the walk sort of thing. That if you're gonna like actually do a good job, and I think also like your staff come from your community and like your neighbors and are all, I mean, they're all local and then like hopefully invested in each other.
So I think that having collective bargaining at an organization is going to force the mindset shifts in regards to shared decision-making and giving up some of that power that is necessary especially in collecting institutions when you have cultural collections and when you have art, in terms of who has the authority to tell the story or to control an object or how it is cared for, how it is treated, how it is interpreted. And I think so much of the intentions on bringing in, having more collaboration and community involvement, and to make collections more relevant, to make exhibits and experiences more welcoming, that the paradigms of museums are still necessarily holding on to that sole decision-making power. And so I think that having an organized staff is going to force that mindset shift to really push museums to be more, to better collective liberation, so that, because they are legally obligated to share decision-making, and I think that they have to be forced to do that before they can actually and authentically do that with their communities.
Yeah, and I guess what I would add to what has already been said, and which I wholeheartedly agree with, in addition to just that shift of mindset, there's also, although the management of MNHS still retains the authority to make decisions about the direction of programming at the Historical Society or what have you, now there is a collective group of voices that can speak up if we disagree with those kinds of decisions without the same kind of fear of retaliation that existed prior to unionization. Not to say that there won't be attempts at retaliation if somebody speaks up. Can never predict what management will do. But there's a group of people and a system that can back up workers should they ever question what is going on, should they ever speak out about a direction being taken that is inappropriate. So it gives workers the ability to advocate more powerfully for changing directions in a more positive way.
Just echoing a little bit what has already been said. For me, at a really basic level, it's not necessarily about influencing the mission, but being able to carry out what the mission actually is. A huge part of that is retaining staff who are able to do that. So I remember having a conversation with a manager years ago when we were facing a particular situation that could have, pre-pandemic, that could have resulted in a large layoff. And we, as a staff, were asking if the value in us was seen, because we had people in my job title who had PhDs, people who had been teaching for 30 years, so had that kind of experience, people who had really important cultural knowledge, and we were all being faced with a layoff, and trying to acknowledge that these people exist, they're doing this job, and we need to be able to afford to do this job is an important piece of it.
And then one other thing that I think has been becoming more and more clear is that the instances where there's a movement and a drive to unite the workers around a specific thing that comes from management tends to be hey, we're short-staffed, and we need people to take on this, this work. So would you like to sign up and volunteer and do this? Whereas in the organizing process and onward, there's a lot more rallying around hey, this isn't fair, and we want to make things fair and make things happen in a way that work for everybody. Do you want to rally around this and do this collective work? And I think just the two separate directions of we didn't prepare for this to happen, and now it's happening, so we need people to go on all hands on deck, versus we want and we actively encourage every hand to come on deck that's ready to come on deck, and we'll work together to make things a little more equitable, a little more fair, and do all of those mission, vision, and values things that we do in every LSAT.
Well, I would love to do a round of semi-closing thoughts before we go to questions. Yeah. Unions, pro, con?
I think unions maybe aren't for everyone, for every workplace, but I think it's very clear when they are. and they are a good thing, and very, very pro-union. And I just think in particular, all of us up here organized under the same team at ASME, and I mean, all unions are good unions for the most part, right? But we have really, really enjoyed working with the ASME team, and they have been an incredible resource to us, while also making sure that we are the ones who are running our own union, right? We are the ones who are making the decisions. They are our sage, wise guides, but at the end of the day, this is our workplace, this is our decisions, and it's just been incredibly empowering. So yeah, really not a terrible way to spend a pandemic for me, honestly. 2.5 years could be a lot worse things going on in my life. So yeah.
I guess I can take it from here. So I think kind of building off of what Maya said, of course, big shout out to the folks from AFSCME who are in the audience that helped us get organized. Kyle and Tom, you guys are great. But I think what a lot of folks really need to understand about unions if they're not experienced in union matters is that you are your union. If you have a union in your workplace and it's not working quite the way you want it to, having a union means you have a say in how that operates. So you can get involved and shift that direction if it needs to be. Or if you don't have a union in your workplace, guess what? Getting a union is the way that you achieve that ability to have a say in your workplace and be able to influence some of the decisions that impact your true day-to-day life of how much are you getting paid, how much do you have to fear losing your job, things like that. So to me, unions are the purest form of democracy in action, and I think they're for absolutely everybody. No shade, Maya, though. No shade.
And I think one of the reasons that I see the unionizing wave in culture workers as being so important is because I think it really helps to build greater solidarity and recognition of you are a worker and you are doing valid work, even and to sort of bridging the gap that has grown around education and that status, so that we can start to shift the accountability of the situations that we are in upwards, rather than us being culture workers and shifting it downwards. And so I think it's helping to build broader worker solidarity by saying, yes, this is work. We are workers, just like people at Amazon, just like people on farms, just like people in hospitals. We're all doing valid, necessary work, and we are all fighting together for a better situation. So I think that is one of the reasons I'm so excited to see this wave of culture workers.
Yeah, I want to add on to that because what I think, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but something that I think I've talked to a number of you about, and that is like, it feels sort of something that I think also is very common at cultural institutions and I think can be applied more broadly, is this idea of like a distance from like laborers that you might think of as like using your bodies to work in sort of traditional unionized fields. And I think it felt really important within our campaign to sort of reorient people to think about themselves as workers. And there were a lot of people who are workers who were eligible for the union who really, like, it was clear that they really identified up, like, with management. And they were given the sense that they had power, and some of them did, but also a lot of them didn't. And they just kind of were, like, being sort of coddled a little bit, or, like, told that they were a little special, or, like, you know, you're like, you wanna be a boss, and so like I don't want to go against them. And I just think, I don't know, I think my main thing that I came out of, like whenever I talk about this, I think it feels really important to remind people that they're workers too, and they're not like, you're not sort of different from traditional union work. And I think also a very cool thing that I felt in organizing was like, once I was involved in a union, suddenly like everyone around me had a union story, you know, like family members who had worked for unions, or like, you know, like me and two of the people on our organizing committee all had grandmothers who worked for the International Garment Workers Union that we all learned like after the campaign. And I don't know, just things like that you're kind of like, this isn't just like a little thing we're doing something that's part of this like huge movement that has been around for a long time that I took a lot of energy from.
I agree with that quite a bit. And then if I can add something to it as well is, like in the process of organizing, you do a lot of things, like you listen to Pete Seeger and you buy like a book about the history of labor and you read through those. But I know that it's cliche and maybe even overdone, but like over the weekend, I was thinking about like, oh yeah, we wouldn't have this if it wasn't because of the unions that had fought for this. Or just reading about unions that had been created over time, where before the Chicago Teachers Union, when the teachers weren't getting paid, they like marched in 5 lines to the 5 banks that weren't paying their taxes, and they threw books at the bankers and they flipped their tables. It's like, well, we're not asking to do all that. We're just asking to like come to the table and negotiate over something. But really, a lot of that learning about how much unions directly and indirectly improve people's working conditions. When I was an ununionized worker with Chicago Public Schools, and we were called back in to work in person, we got one little baggie with like 3 masks and a little thing of hand sanitizer. And the only reason we got that is because the teachers union was able to negotiate N95s for the teachers. And they got like 3 of those, which is not enough. But just the myriad of ways that unions, whether you know it or not, have improved your working conditions in your life. And now like there is a weekend and there are like OSHA requirements and you don't have to fall off the ladder every day. So a lot of those things, I think, become more solidified.
Well, are there questions from our in-house audience or from our audience in the magical faraway land of the internet? Yeah. Yeah, you want to come up and take the microphone from me so the folks online can hear you.
Yeah, so I work at MIA, and we just finished settling our contract, and pretty immediately after that, there was a lot of retaliatory action from management, and so we're planning some. I think we're going to start getting kind of nasty and pretty public, which is sort of a preface to in sort of trying to mobilize people and figure out how we want to sort of deliver this message. I think a lot of us on staff have been learning more about the power structure at the museum, and trying to figure out ways to sort of how can we be strategic about who we're reaching out to kind of have the most impact. And I was curious if any of you felt like in organizing you learn more about how power was sort of sectioned off within the institution, and if you were able to then sort of use that knowledge to mobilize people at all.
Don't everybody talk at once.
I guess the short answer to your question is yes. I'm struggling to think of individual anecdotes right now, but MNHS, I think to anybody who has ever worked there, knows it as a very opaque institution where how decisions are made, who makes those decisions, what policies are informing those decisions is something that is completely unknown, generally speaking, at least up until we unionized. Now we have a little bit more of some leverage to at least demand a meet and confer with management to hash out how is this decision being made, who is making this decision, and so on, to get some clarity for that. I'm struggling to think of specific cases right now because it's just not popping in my head, but yeah, I think that is something that we share too, that we experienced quite a bit.
What came to mind for me was just like a conversation with a coworker or a group of coworkers in a department where we were kind of trying to be like, have you ever felt unappreciated, and what did you do? Like you were doing all this extra work, and like, what did you do? And this one person was like, well, I talked to my boss and then I got a raise, whatever. And we were kind of like, whoa, are you kidding me? That no one else has given us that answer. Like, it was just like and I feel like in the conversation, there was this kind of sense from them of sort of being like, oh, well, I actually I did ask and I got it. But it was interesting to see someone where I was like, okay, well, that's great. That's the system. It's good that worked for you, and you're the only person I've ever talked to who has had that experience, and it sounds like it's because you have a good boss. And that was true. She did have a good boss. And I feel like while maybe ineffective in that conversation with that person, learning that was actually really helpful to talk about then with other people and be like, well, actually this is possible. They told you that your boss told you they couldn't give you a raise, but why could she ask for a raise and demonstrate why she needs it and get it? And I think just those discrepancies in power, I mean, it was very clear, if someone's boss was powerful, those workers felt protected and they got the things that they needed. And if someone's boss wasn't powerful, they didn't. And I think just showing that actually it can work. There is someone who's able to advocate for their workers and get these things, and that's not working actually for most of us, so we're doing it ourselves.
Not to hog the mic, but I thought of my example. So something that I had a lot of experience of in the previous year was FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act leaves, both from my daughter Annabelle being born and then her having RSV. And I think something that we've developed as a union, mainly through solidarity and collaboration with each other, is a network of people who have experienced FMLA and can talk each other through that process of who at MNHS are the people that make the decisions about whether or not your leave gets approved. What are they factoring into that? What are the things that should be going on your forms to make sure you get your leave approved? Things like that we've been able to talk about a little bit more. There are still some things regarding FMLA that we definitely need to get cleared up with management at MNHS, but we have a much better network of support for people who are going through that.
I don't know if this is an answer that's helpful or if it is just me being exceptionally cynical, but I think people sometimes give their leadership too much credit for the decisions that get made. Because I think I think the decisions and the edicts that come out with the assumption that nobody is going to question them. And the minute somebody starts pushing back, this was just my experience and my institution, that leadership was completely unprepared for how to respond to that. And which really, I think that revealed the sort of, this was one person had an idea and nobody really cared enough to workshop it, they didn't realize that there were problems, that there were gaps, that there were holes until it got rolled out. And the experience that had been the norm for so long, I don't know if it was the pandemic and people are like, there's this disease out there that's gonna take me out at any time, YOLO, I'm just gonna, or, to their credit, the work that our leadership has done to try and bring in a more diverse work staff has raised the bar for what they're expecting from their leadership. So I think for so long the norm had been, we made this decision, everyone just accepted it. And just by asking questions and pushing back, I think that reveals where the structures are and where the cracks lie, because who's coming in to kind of clean up the mess at the time, and who gets deferred to. And I don't know if MIA has any sort of all-staff type presentations where they do any kind of Q&A and how they field certain questions. But so again, I don't know if this helps, but I really think the expectation is that nobody is going to ask how the decisions get made. You're just supposed to trust that this is the best case.
Yeah, I think that's making me realize the degree to which organizing felt like it's just sort of being a toddler who's why? Why is that? Why did you do that? Why are you why do you have to go to a different institution to get a promotion? why do you have to, why can't we be involved in this? Like, and I think just like questioning feels like a lot of like activating people and like making them sort of aware of their potential power in the workplace was just encouraging them to question what they were used to accepting.
And if I could add to that, one of the things that kept sticking out to me over the course of even before I like knew there was a union card to be signed, is kind of the shifts in language that were being used in meetings in general. Two things that I learned you don't mess with is like people's family and people's money. So during the compensation analysis, when there was a shift in conversation from like transparency to appropriate transparency is where I think there started to be some more of that investigation and some of that pushback. Or when we found out that the premiums for health insurance were going to be increasing because we've been using a whole lot of health insurance recently. It's like, well, that's what it's for, right? You're supposed to have health insurance so that you can use it, but to have that kind of used as a consequence, and that like there's a lot of you who are using health insurance, so yeah, it's going to be a little more expensive and will be appropriately transparent as things happen. Is a lot of those like trickiness in language was at least for me like what got me looking into like, well, how are a lot of these decisions made, and then finding out that a lot of these decisions are contractors all the way down. So it's not even people who like are full and regular museum employees. It's people who are on a timeline. And like, no hate to like the contractors who are watching this. I know some wonderful contractors, but to have like people who are fully invested and fully in the museum, I think is also helpful to having that power structure that you can fully navigate.
Other questions? Yeah.
Hey, can you hear me all right? All right. So first of all, thank you guys for sharing your experience. It's been really good. I have a question about contract negotiation processes. So my wife works at a certain reproductive healthcare organization that is in the process of negotiating their contract. And like many of you shared, the organization and management came out favorably in the beginning when the union first went public, said they were fully supportive, but then as contract negotiations got underway, things got kind of nasty and have kind of ground to a slow moving halt. So that has become very dispiriting for her and many of her colleagues. So I was wondering what sustained you through that very hard process in your experiences, and do you have any advice for people who go through the same? Thanks.
Well, I think first off, just a disclaimer, I was not at the table. I don't know that I could have been at the table. It was 40 weeks for us, which I understand is not a terribly long time to get your contract, but it was hard. There was a lot of, I think from our table team, just a lot of anger, sadness. I don't know, I don't want to speak for them, but I think we tried really hard to reflect in our actions the support that our table team had. Every week before we did bargaining, we held what was called a gauntlet, where we would all, as many people as we could gather, would sit out front of the, well, not sit, but gather outside of the room where bargaining happened to cheer on our team as they went in. And not only was that good for our team to see, but then management saw that too. Every week for 40 week minus the like 2 months they took off for bargaining, we were there and we were saying, hey, you know, we're here, we're not going anywhere. We have these people's backs. This is supportive. And we echoed that with our social media. We had, you know, campaigns of just photos, hundreds of photos at this point, of workers saying, this is why I organize, this is why I'm union, this is what I'm bargaining for, this is how terribly I'm paid, and that's not okay. So just finding lots of ways that we can publicly, outwardly say, this team is negotiating for us for our best interests, and they're doing an incredible job. And I think also we just have been saying it to their faces as often as possible. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm looking at the three who were in it in this room. Thank you. Just the solidarity really is kind of the big answer.
I think we might have time for one more question. Yeah.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate it very much. Learned a lot about what public institutions do in labor management issues. The question I have, actually there's two questions. There's one for those that were siloed in the MNHS, and then for the others, another question. And it has to do with what it was in the past and how you're going to bring it into the future. For the siloed organizations, how did you bridge the gap in communication to get everybody in, and how are you going to keep it for the future?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things that go into bridging the silos piece, and I think one of those things that is really, really important is to approach organizing conversations with an ear to listen, not just to talk at people. You know, when I did a lot of outreach initially in our campaign at sites that I did not work at. So I'm based out at the History Center as a History Day employee, but I did a lot of outreach with some of our sites in greater Minnesota. And you know, when you're doing that, you're not going to get anywhere approaching them and being like, hey, me, Kyle from the History Center is going to tell you why we need a union. It's hey, how is work going for you out at Lindbergh or out at the Mille Lacs Indian Museum or what have you? And just start with, let's learn about your experiences. Oh, hey, I've actually experienced a lot of that stuff too. We have a lot more in common than we've been led to believe across the sites network, and I think that was really huge. And I think another part of that is being willing to meet folks in whatever way it is that they need. In our organizing drive, I put on hundreds of miles onto my beat-up 2011 Impala to go drive out into greater Minnesota and meet folks to have a discussion or get a card signed or what have you. So being willing to physically demonstrate that you are willing to put in the work to bridge that gap, I think is a really important component in that.
Then for the other group, what I would like to know is, how did you ensure that you had good leadership for your union, and how are you going to maintain that leadership, good leadership for the union?
No, it's okay. I don't work at the Walker anymore, so I can't speak for moving forward. But in terms of once we were like ratified and had to elect our board and a president and whatnot, we essentially did those things because we had to, and I think we really tried to make sure that like the president wasn't actually in charge, essentially, that it was still anyone who came to the meeting, people who were invested, both because we wanted it to feel equal and not recreate the hierarchy that we were pushing back against, but also because like it's hard to be in charge, and we didn't like it was hard for us to find someone who wanted to be president because everyone was kind of like, oh, I don't want to be the top dog, you know? And we were like, you don't have to be, it's okay. We're all going to work on it together. We need someone to be president. You will have to do very specific things because you're president. But I think it felt really important for us to maintain a sense of like equal decision making in the group. And that is also like the benefit. I think the Walker's eligible bargaining unit is like 70 some people. So it's simpler when it's not a huge unit. Like at the Art Institute of Chicago and the School of the Art Institute, those are each 300 person bargaining units, and it's like it's a different game. But I think just trying to maintain like investment in each other, and like Kyle said, just like asking people and listening and not feeling like you're like leading from the top, but just trying to maintain the like structure that we created in our organizing committee.
So I think we're at the Science Museum still kind of fumbling through that a bit. We all just have our interim leadership positions that were elected recently, and and this is just me speaking personally, that I really feel like in order to have trusted leadership, it comes through demonstrating trustworthiness rather than expecting people to just inherently trust you. And I think you can put people in a position to be able to do that, and when more people in your membership have an understanding of how all of the processes work. So just for funniness, because so I work in evaluation, I work with numbers, I work with spreadsheets, and I think I was typecast as the treasurer because nobody else wanted to do anything with numbers. They said, you do this because we trust you. And I'm like, well, I don't want this to just be another enumerate group. I want everyone to understand exactly how this works so that this doesn't become a mystery, so that the next person who comes into this role has 30 people to keep them accountable. And so it isn't having little bubbles of expertise. I mean, of course, people who are good at things and have a natural inclination to do things should be, able to do those things and to share that knowledge and that expertise. But so I think to have successful leadership is the leaders need to demonstrate trustworthiness rather than wondering why people just don't trust them for being in a leadership position. But and also like Ella said, that like our position is that like, well, we have to have these roles filled to do certain functional things, but how do we get people out of that hierarchy mindset of like, this is a title and this is what the president does because that's what it says in the Constitution. But anybody can has just as much a say as this executive board that got elected.
I think that amount of consent and accountability is deeply alien to the structures of many museums so far. So here's hoping we can work towards changing that. Thank you all so much for coming. I think we're about at time. And yeah, happy International Workers' Day.